Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 24th of February 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we will be joined by live video, Skype link by Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches. Of course, Alex deep in Holland. That's pretty appropriate because I'm sure he's below sea level. But apparently the weather is particularly gloomy there with hail. Whereas in UK, or most of UK at the moment, the sun is shining, Plymouth is glorious, and we've got reports of blue sky, at least in East Yorkshire. Essex is looking pretty good, and Pembrokeshire as well. So the weather is on the up. Politically, things are still very much, I think, on the down. We want to kick off with the European referendum.
Alex, this article from Guido Fawkes here, suggesting that really some people don't seem to know whether to be in or out.
Absolutely. This man, Mr. Mack, is the Conservative MP for Havant on the south coast. And he clearly told the selecting committee of his constituency Conservative Association that he would back the United Kingdom leaving the EU. And now he's issued a statement picked up here by Guido Fawkes, order.com, with a hyphen between the two orders if you want to look it up, saying that actually, having carefully considered the matter, he's going to back the Prime Minister's deal and wishes the United Kingdom to stay in. Now, the Conservatives had a particular push in the last two electoral cycles to bring on board a more diverse selection of people, which in itself may be laudable. You may be indifferent to it or otherwise, but they had a particular focus on Asian self-made businessmen, in his case Cantonese, in other cases South Asian, and they thought, well, these people are going to increase diversity. But you can see that whatever the colour of your skin, you're just as likely to be nobbled as any other category of person. So we've really got a fake diversity in Parliament. People will do as they're told by those who hold their purse strings. And the solution, of course, is to vote for a candidate who is not allied to any of the Deadwood parties.
Yeah, so, well, the discussion over the referendum continues. And, of course, yesterday we were going through the document which Cameron had presented to the debate. And one of the big issues that he had mentioned was that this agreement would be legally binding. It would create international law. Today we're seeing coverage that Michael Gove is contradicting David Cameron and saying that in fact there is no legal precedent in this whatsoever, and the deal could be overturned by the European Court of Justice. What's your take on this one?
I have to say I'm with Mr. Gove. The headline in ITV News here is that PM's EU deal could be overturned by European Court of Justice, Michael Gove claims. And Mr. Gove is one of the constitutionally most informed people in the land. He's been Justice Secretary and served as one of the first commoners who's been in the Lord Chancellor's role. His civil service advice has been excellent and frank. There's no reason to doubt that. And I think he really has taken a decision of conscience on this, whatever you think of him as Education Secretary before that. I don't think there's any reason you can analyse for him to want to lie about this. The ECJ in Luxembourg has a long track record with its unelected people who are not even proper judges of striking down anything that smacks too much of national sovereignty. And the EU is a federal model like the US in that the Supreme Court, the ECJ in our model, does have final say over politicians. So don't believe Cameron. And someone's asking in the chat room, has the Prime Minister's deal been published yet? No, it still hasn't.
Okay, well, you wanted to mention the Lithuanian president, and we will get the deal sooner or later. We will get the deal.
Yes, you can see what a battle axe Dalia Grybauskaite is, the president of Lithuania. I know that she's a darling of Eurocrats and federalists because she's thought to be a lovely, frank lady who speaks her mind. Well, she certainly did this time. She told ITV News cameras as she went in, or lots of cameras, but ITV's picked it up, when she was asked, do you think that you'll see the EU deal fall apart tonight? No, 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 she said. I think everyone will have their own drama, then we'll agree. And with a triumphal smile, she went into the building. I think she's telling the truth. She knew from the start that this was going to be pre-digested argy-bargy ending in an agreement.
Presumably, Alex, the normal game will have been played that there will have been a pre-meeting meeting in order to decide the outcome of this which is why she's so confident. Isn't that the tactic of the EU?
Yes, and the poisonous thing about the EU is that this has filtered down to national level. We're now in the third generation of eurocracy from Britain's side, the fifth generation in France and Benelux and so on. And people who've been in this system then take that back to their own parliaments and their own governments. And you find in the civil service, I saw it myself as a British civil servant, that even down at junior level, people will nobble the 2 or 3 main players in a decision and pre-cook the arrangement before it goes to the table. So yes, that's exactly what happens.
Well, what are the French saying about this?
The French wording of this article, again by Les Echos, the French business paper, is Cameron obtient un statut spécial pour la Grande-Bretagne. So he's obtained a special status for the UK within the European Union. The trouble is, it hasn't been published, and Les Echos is forced to point out, although they would rather keep this under wraps, they do concede in this article that the main selling point of this supposed deal, I'll believe it when I see it, doesn't have any legal value. This main selling point being that ever closer union that Jean Monnet phrase from the 1950s doesn't apply to the United Kingdom. Well, even if it does have legal force, it's only going to apply to any future treaties. It's not going to apply retrospectively to the treaties of Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon, and many others. So our treaty commitments and the current bureaucracy that are in place already force ever closer union, already force any decision made by governments to be reviewed by the ECJ, for example. So I'm afraid we're locked in unless we assert our sovereignty.
Alex, Mike and I were talking about the EU referendum earlier on, and we were saying it's a very confused situation. We've got people changing their mind. We've got people you wouldn't think are against saying that they're against. What is your assessment of what's going on politically in Westminster at the moment? Is there genuine confusion, or is there some sort of psychological operation being played out here in order to confuse the British public, and then at the last moment it all swings to we must stay in? What do you think the situation is?
I would say that because of the social and political backgrounds they're drawn from, most of the Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs, even those who are Eurosceptic, a minority of them, are well informed on the issues and the legal situation, because the movements that they join as cooperative members or whatever force them to look at these legal issues. On the Conservative side, and that's where most of the ifs and buts and doubters seem to be now, there genuinely is a whole generation of people of my age, 30s, who have come in straight from business or public administration, who genuinely do not have a clue until now forced to confront the issue by constituents' letters. They don't have a clue what the European Union is, that it has legal personality since 2009, that it can justify itself retrospectively at the Treaty of Amsterdam. These things are beyond their ken. And so I think a lot of them, now being written to by sane and sober constituents, have no easy, pat answers. So I think some of them are having troubles of conscience, but of course they're not all fantastically rich, and you can be got at these days even if you are rich through having certain scandals whipped up against you. So I think a few are pressured and blackmailed, a few just don't care and are taking the European shilling, and perhaps a lot more are, as Gove's wife Sarah Vine has written about her husband, I think they're genuinely agonised now, and a few may be doing the right thing. The thing is to be judicious, I think, if you're a constituent of one of these doubting Conservative MPs, and to write to shore them up, and perhaps also to remind them that their treason will never be forgotten if they vote the wrong way.
Alex, thank you very much for that. And of course, you've just used the treason word, which I'm going to pick up on, because the last couple of days we talked about what was happening at the senior echelons of Britain's military. And this gentleman had pointed out, Lord Richards, former Chief of the Defence Staff, he'd pointed out that he'd had to get his name removed from a letter which the government was busy cooking up. He'd actually had to tell Number 10 to take his name off the letter, and a letter that they were apparently drafting concerning a number of retired senior officers who were going to support the Remain in Europe cause. And in that slide, we'd also pointed out the inset is to do with the fact that these dirty tactics were also being used in Edward Heath's days. And of course, more recently, David Cameron had also been bullying business advisors into supporting a pro-EU letter. But this is to do with the military, and credit where it's due, Lord Richards was prepared to stand up and send an email saying that he wanted his name taken off the letter. What we're really dealing with is lies, deceit and propaganda by Cameron. And here is the letter now breaking into the mainstream press. So the Daily Telegraph crowing that Britain must stay in the EU to protect itself from ISIL, according to former military chiefs. And we say these people are complete cowards and traitors. I am very happy to say this. I've seen this type of military officer before, totally subservient to the political will, total cowardice if they're faced with any embarrassment to do with their status or high position. And here are these people saying that they believe strongly it's in our national interest to remain an EU member. We've served around the world in almost every conflict. We're proud to have served our country, but I think we need to stay in the European Union. I'm going to say, as a former military officer, I find these people totally repugnant. This is treason. And as we'll see in a minute, these people are the very people that have betrayed Britain's military. I can't put all the names on screen. There's some 13 of them, but I thought we'd just have a look at some of them. We've got Jock Stirrup. We've got Mike Jackson. A lot of people, a lot of time for former General Mike Jackson. Michael Rose, here they all are now suddenly saying effectively we don't exist as a sovereign nation anymore. Admiral Michael Boyce, we'll come to him in a minute. And of course, it has only been the UK column that exposed the dirty backdoor meetings going on where senior British military officers were plotting to create this union with the French. Now, what the reason we've got Sir Michael Boyce there is that he was challenged on the fact that the EU was building a treasury, it's building a supranational state with its own military forces. He was challenged a couple of days ago, and my contact said, my goodness, he went to complete jelly. And I believe the reason for this is, of course, at the time, Michael Boyce was challenged as to what was going on with the European Union and the impact in particular on the military. He would have already known his name was on that letter due to come out from number 10. And that is where it came from. It wasn't created by the military officers themselves. It was created by number 10. Well, this is the sort of thing they've got up to in the past. British Admiral Paul Lambert, as the UK column captioned, cap in hand to the French. And this was part of our article where we talked about these closed-door meetings put together by the Franco-British Council, where, for example, in the residence of the British ambassador in his Paris residence, there was a roundtable meeting held with the French behind closed doors, which included senior French and British military officers. I say this is treason. I'd like anybody to prove to me that it wasn't treason. And now we've got the same treasonous people coming forward to put their name to a political letter which has been created by number 10. Alex, I've had trouble keeping my hat on today because I am so disgusted with these people. As far as I'm concerned, it's treason. What do you make of the backdoor conversations that we've seen leading to the Franco-British military pact?
Well, Brian, you just mentioned your background as a former military officer. Well, I'm a former intelligence analyst. And if you see people acting in the highest ranks of the military of any nation, if you're studying it dispassionately as an analyst, if you see them acting against their own evident national sovereignty interest and their oaths to the sovereign, which Martin Edwards has mentioned in the chat room, then you have to ask, what is the hold that the advocates of the other side have against them? And there are only a few possibilities for what has swayed them in these backdoor chats. Fear of loss of status is a big one. That's how a lot of intelligence agencies nobble a lot of agents and bind them into being informers. Blackmail over financial and sexual matters. And some of them may simply just not have the spine. It's terrible to say this about generals and admirals and air chief marshals, but simply not have the spine to say no when told that a political apparatchik has already written something with their name on it.
Well, Alex, all those things you've mentioned, of course, are possible. I spoke to somebody I knew extremely well many years ago who reached a high rank in the military, attempted to get some discussion about what was going on in the country, and I will say the gentleman ran away from me. So this fear, I believe status is a large part of it. Once the gold braid starts to weigh over 4 kilograms, should that be in pounds probably, they get very fearful of their status or anything that could disrupt it. But of course other means of blackmail important. Well, the hypocrisy of these people can be shown by what the press has reported. And of course, if we go back, this is September 2015. The Mail here is saying what is going on with the Ministry of Defence. They're spending 230 million on a PR blitz, while the armed forces are being cut to the bone. And in this article here, former Tory MP and Army Colonel Patrick Mercer said the government had savaged the military's budget. So the military budget savaged to the extent that these people are saying we can't protect ourselves, hence we need to be in Europe. But they were the people in post allowing these cuts to go through. We got a bit more of it here. This is waste of money on Twitter. And of course, this one, which made me laugh in a black humour sense of way, is that, well, we don't actually have aircraft carriers at sea at the moment. Even if we did, as Mike has pointed out many times, we don't have any aircraft to put on them because of the failure of the F-35 project. So what do we boast about? Well, we put cartoon aircraft on the deck of a cartoon character. Now, the people who signed the letter seem to be oblivious to this sort of thing. The army cut from 102 to 82,000, no longer viable for major operations. George Osborne lying over the defence budget, while at the same time you can cook up 1.5 billion to produce a joint intelligence and defence fund. So I haven't got the names of all 13 men. 13 is a very interesting number. I think there's a bit of significance. But here's some of them. We've got Lord Bramall. We've got Lord Guthrie, Jock Stirrup, Mike Jackson, who we've already mentioned. A pretty motley crowd. And when you talk about letters, Alex, well, somebody has already been on the case, because this letter was sent through to us that has been sent to David Cameron. It points out that if we've got between 3,000 and 5,000 battle-trained terrorists already inside Europe, what good is staying within the European Union and free borders? What's that going to do for us? But this gentleman, who's an ex-soldier, goes on to say, let's remember, of course, that it was French Exocet which hit Sheffield, leaving 20 dead, hit Atlantic Conveyor, 12 British dead, and Glamorgan, 13 British dead. And at the same time, it was the Belgians who were refusing to give us small arms ammunition during the Falklands War. But apparently, Admiral Michael Boyce is totally ignorant of these facts. If you look at the photograph, he's got his eyes closed, which I think is pretty significant. And Alex, before I hand you back, of course, in this Telegraph article is an embedded video. Here is our leader, David, our King Cameron. And what was a key part of his message? It was essentially that Mr. Putin is going to eat our children unless we stay in the European Union. We are seeing unbelievable propaganda spewing out of Westminster. These people must be desperate.
Yes, Brian, they must be desperate, because there is no way of believing them to sincerely hold what they're stating. All these 13 military signatories, yes, they've all had long intelligence reading careers and long careers of collaborating with partner nations within NATO. That's the key word, isn't it? NATO, not the EU. Which of the 13 can say that he has ever received a piece of intelligence through EU channels? None. The EU didn't have an intelligence agency until, by some reckonings, although these things have slow starts, but so by some reckonings, a few months ago. Terrorism and crime cooperation. Yes, there's all this wretched Europol, which we spoke about in recent programs, that's been set up in the last few years with a British director. But that hasn't got anything like the capacity of bilateral intelligence and criminal actionable intelligence sharing that we have with people around the world, including with people with nations that are not in the EU or indeed in NATO. So there's no way that there's any kind of justifiable background for what's being written about the EU. It has got to be either wishful thinking or being duped or forced into signing.
Well, Alex, just to reinforce the point that you've made, of course, with all of the intelligence material passed around, it was joint material with the Americans, which always had precedence. That was the most reliable information. I know there'll be some people questioning this, but we're just talking about the world as it was. We're not going to get into deeper things, just basic facts. While the Cold War was on, of course, it was the work with the Americans that was most important. And then there was a hierarchy for that intelligence material where many European countries were fed tidbits because they simply were not to be trusted. And it's very interesting to think that actually the bond between the Commonwealth countries existed within the NATO organisation. And as far as I remember, other countries were peripheral to that. So your point that what has Europe ever achieved as a collection of countries, I think is spot on.
Yes, and I see that Linda in the chat room has pointed out that her local chief constable in North Wales, when challenged about charging people with treason for this kind of nonsensical statement, replied as a chief constable, that's outside my competence, charging someone with treason. Well, he might be away with the fairies believing that, but thank God we live in a common law jurisdiction and anyone can charge a treasonous public official with treason.
Indeed, and or misprision of treason. I'll just say that I was sent a really excellent email this morning. I wasn't able to process it in time for the news, but essentially it was saying that as a result of an individual member of the public reporting treason at their local police station, they had a visit by what they described was a goon, a particularly ignorant and unpleasant police constable, who was more or less saying that, well, it wasn't outside his pay grade, it was outside his intelligence grade. My quick email response was, well, this shows you how frightened the more senior people are because they can't risk putting an intelligent officer on the case because, of course, it would all come unravelled so quickly. But people writing to their MPs and emailing does make a difference. It made a difference with the Syria vote, the bombing Syria vote, both times, I believe. And perhaps we should also be encouraging people to do it as this EU referendum looms. Before we sort of leave the immediate subject of referendums, we've just mentioned NATO. That was the point, so I wanted to come to. There's been reports that Turkey has been or is about to be suspended from NATO. Now, this is a Facebook page that's been set up, but I believe that the American organisation Veterans Today is actually stating that Turkey has been suspended because apparently the alliance is so uncertain as to the actions of the Turkish Prime Minister. I don't know whether you can help us at all with this one, Alex.
What I would say, Brian, is it's quite possible that some NATO forum or other has temporarily suspended Turkey because NATO is a multi-layered organisation. There's people who've been researching it for decades, either as investigative journalists or as former insiders in the military or intelligence parts of NATO, who have said, well, quite apart from the fact that there's two headquarters, one in Brussels and one in Mons, one civilian and one military, there's also concentric rings, and as you mentioned and alluded to moments ago, nations sharing within NATO but not sharing to the whole of NATO. So quite possibly Turkey has been at a, shall we say, at a political level, temporarily suspended from the workings of some NATO mechanisms, which is only fair because if you join up to a mutual defence league with an Article 5 commitment, that's the NATO equivalent, but there's other alliances in the world that have similar ones, to defend each other if attacked, then you need to have a safeguard against one country going into the hands of a nutcase general or even prime minister or president who will declare war on a neighbour on behalf of all his allies. You have to be able to protect against that.
Okay.
Well, Alex, tell us about George Soros then.
George Soros is becoming a household name in the Netherlands. I never thought I'd see the day. The Dutch do have an alternative media scene, but this, if you look at the top left of the screen, comes from NOS, which is the Dutch equivalent of the BBC, the public broadcaster. And here they are reporting Amerikaanse miljardair sponsort ja-campagne. American billionaire is sponsoring the yes campaign on the Ukraine referendum. And as if you'll recall from previous appearances of mine, this is to do with a constitutionally required but not legally binding referendum that the Dutch are being asked to vote on in April regarding whether the EU's association agreement with Ukraine should be approved. You'll recall that the last time the EU signed one with Ukraine, it ended with riots and a coup. And now the Dutch are putting this to the electorate in a non-binding, indicative referendum. One would have thought that the Dutch media would cover up this foreign funding again, but things do seem to be changing. And as I've alluded to in the case of Britain, younger journalists don't seem to be as timid as some of their older colleagues. And they are reporting, even in mainstream publicly funded channels, that there's this gentleman called Soros.
This is another example of it. And if we just take one quote out of this one, Soros was convicted of insider dealing in 2002 and lost his final appeal in 2011. He has invested part of his $22 billion family capital in Eastern Europe via the hedge fund Quantum Group. And that's exactly why this gentleman is so interested in your yes vote. How would military interference in a conflict with Russia, something which Soros is also urging besides, deliver any stability?
And this isn't just from any old paper. This is from Reformatorisch Dagblad, which is the serious Protestant paper, which until very, very recently has been telling its readers that they must never support anti-EU parties because although they're a conservative Christian newspaper, you're supposed to vote for European Union in the interest of international peace. Well, all of a sudden, I think the lid's been blown off that, and even a lot of conservative Protestants, conservative Roman Catholic, conservative Jewish journalists in the Netherlands who in the past would tell their readers we must be involved in any international organization going, are now actually having a big long think about this. So Soros is definitely not enamored of the Dutch people and vice versa, I think. The Dutch do jealously guard their independence. You might think of them as the archetypal internationalist country, but no, they're very proud of how they won their independence before America, a long time before America, on a point of principle against overwhelming odds. And there's still some of that spirit left in the Netherlands.
Well, in the meantime, then, with Cameron claiming that his latest deal is going to be written into international law, Norway seems to be suggesting they will suspend international law under certain circumstances.
Yes, and again, this is from a very serious national institution newspaper, the Berlingske Tidende, which is perhaps the greatest newspaper in Denmark, and they're reporting on something that's too sensitive for either of their neighbours to cover, although it concerns the two neighbours, Sweden and Norway. Norway has realised, not being in the EU, or Schengen, but it is in NATO, which Sweden isn't. So that there's kind of opposition going on there. Sweden is in the EU and Schengen, but not in NATO, and Norway is in NATO, but not in the EU or Schengen. Sorry, it is in Schengen, but not in the EU. They've realised that there's going to be a mass exodus of whatever these migrants are out of Sweden if the Swedish state collapses and isn't able to deal with them. And the very idea that Norway should admit openly to having contingency plans for the collapse of a Nordic neighbour would have been, I find myself saying this a lot, but I can't see any other way to say it. It would have been unthinkable until a couple of years ago. And all of a sudden, a Danish broadsheet is saying, yes, the Norwegians have these plans. One of the subheadings in that article is Sverige kan kollaps. So Sweden could collapse.
Can I just ask a question, if I may, Alex? In simple terms, what is the main driving force for that collapse? We obviously in this country we see almost no reporting on internal Swedish politics. What would be bringing Sweden to a point of collapse?
I'd recommend that people read Breitbart's news coverage on this, particularly Oliver Lane's coverage. But in a nutshell, they and the Norwegians, to a lesser extent, have a problem of mandarins in the national government who sincerely believe that their country should be thrown open to the whole world and that there should be mixing of cultures to the point where there is no identifiable culture and everyone is then poor and beholden to the government and to world government, in fact. So it's a self-inflicted catastrophe, and often it's blamed on the EU, but Sweden has every exemption going, like Britain does. It's not part of the euro. There's no need for it to have joined Schengen. They did so voluntarily. And even within Schengen, the Danes are in Schengen too, but the migrants crossing the Danish territory on the way to Sweden aren't eligible in some cases for asylum in Denmark, but they know they will be in Sweden. So you have to look for the answer in national bureaucracies.
Okay, thank you.
So what's going on here, Alex? Moldova rising against corruption. Is this another coloured revolution type thing going on? But Foreign Policy magazine here suggesting that that doesn't mean they're going to immediately come over to the West.
I think there's definitely been an interest in cooking up a colour revolution in Moldova because it's sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. So between an existing EU member to which it has close ethnic ties and Ukraine, which, as we all know, is the bone of contention between the West and Russia. Now, the point about it is that Foreign Policy magazine is part of the Washington establishment, a very internationalist organ. But they're having to ask themselves, frankly now, what does it entail if a small Eastern European country has protests against corruption, because corruption is endemic in all those countries. And they've had to realize that, as they're saying in the headline here, the West is about to lose Moldova. In other words, just because people rise up against hideous levels of national corruption and poverty does not mean that they wish to fall into the arms of EU or NATO allies any more than they wish to fall into the arms of Russia. So if you follow through on the rhetorical question implied by the title, what is the West going to lose Moldova to? Well, they're not going to Russia, because that's the whole point of the article. They're not going to the EU. So they are being lost to independence, apparently, to national self-determination. And this is the unthinkable outcome, that the people of Moldova should assert their sovereignty.
Well, I hope they do. Now, this article, of course, isn't really about Eurovision. The point you want to make here is to do with people who have come into countries through immigration being sent back and the consequences of that.
Yes, there are many tragic cases in European and Eurasian history in the 20th century of whole people groups being deported, largely by Stalin, largely because they were Turkic or Islamic groups, and he feared, perhaps rightly, that they would collaborate with Germany, so he packed them off to the wilds of Siberia and Central Asia. And one of these groups was the Crimean Tatars from Crimea, obviously, who did return in substantial numbers to Crimea when it was still Ukraine. And then, of course, they've been kicked out again or had life made difficult for them since Russia's reabsorption of Crimea. The point I'd make is one to set people thinking, really. If you look at these deportation waves, most of them are unknown to Westerners because they occurred in the Soviet Union, but there's been many that I've covered in the Soviet Union, or even Israel-Palestine. Whatever the historical injustices of the matter, you need to ask yourself careful questions if you're told that people need a right of return, or that millions of people whose grandparents or great-great-grandparents were deported need to have an automatic entitlement to citizenship or even to go back to the properties that they had 4 generations ago. Other people live there. Other people have established farms and factories there. What's to happen to them? You need to look beyond that to the question of who stoked the tensions in the first place and what has happened with these refugee groups in the 2, 3, 4 generations that they've lived in another part of the world. Have they been integrated into new territories? Have they been given compensation or a head start financially by the states that are responsible for what happened? Or have they, as usually happens in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, been held hostage in squalid camps and railway sidecars and all kinds of things for generations so that states can go tub-thumping at each other? So real compassion for refugees and descendants of refugees is to assist them to settle where they currently are, or as close to that as possible, to countries in countries where they speak the language and have the mentality, not to somewhere that their great-great-grandparents were forced out of because they have no further emotional connection with that.
Yeah. Okay, well, this one I want to get your professional or your ex-professional opinion on, but this is coming from DW, and Germany apparently about to unleash Trojan spyware on people's computers and mobile phones. Intelligence agencies in Germany can now use malware to track computers of people under suspicion. The Trojan will be able to track user chats and conversations on smartphones and PCs. A spokesman for the German Interior Ministry announced on Monday that the government had approved the usage of Trojans to monitor suspected citizens. And so it goes on. I just wanted to sort of comment on why they would want to do this. So we've got a bit of graphic here. If you imagine making a connection over the internet, the Germans don't have quite the same facilities as GCHQ, for example. So GCHQ is sitting there at the side, and they have a system called Tempora, which are basically a system of wiretaps on some of the main internet trunks, and they're pulling huge quantities of data. And I believe they have something in the region of 300 people sifting through this data. And that's okay while everyone is doing everything in the clear, as it were. But of course, people aren't doing things in the clear, and people are increasingly using VPNs in order to help protect their privacy. So in this case, Tempora doesn't work. It hits up against the VPN. All they get is a load of encrypted information, which is relatively difficult for them to deal with. So the target for GCHQ and intelligence gathering organizations must be the endpoints then. So the servers at one end and the PCs and mobile phones on the other. Of course, what they're aiming to do is to hack those endpoints so that what they can do is look inside the secure pipe that people's traffic is going along. So if people are hiding their information through obfuscation with a VPN, or they're using SSL encryption or any other kind of encryption, then really the only option is for intelligence agencies to look at the endpoints. And so that is, I believe, why the Germans are looking at writing this type of software and attempting to get it onto people's computers. They're saying that it's going to require a court order to do that. But Alex, it's going to be a bit of fun when this kind of code starts falling into the wrong hands, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. German intelligence, and particularly signals intelligence, has always done things a bit differently than the Anglo-American setup. They've been much more fervent believers in close access, in sitting on the device. So they've done that back in both world wars as well, to the extent that was possible with technology those days, because they've never had a tradition of sifting through the traffic, and their cryptanalysis, strangely for such an intelligent nation, has never been up there with even their rivals in the Second World War. The Poles and the Finns were streets ahead of them in the war. So they've always had this tendency to go that way. And I was intrigued that you mentioned that the spokesman responsible for this, or talking about this, came from the Interior Ministry. That implies to me that the agents doing this will come from the Bundesverfassungsschutz, the Office for the Protection of the Federal Constitution. Now, these guys have got very wide latency to do anything they think necessary to tackle anyone who wishes political change in Germany, because the Germans openly admit in the name of that domestic intelligence agency that what they're interested in is not stopping unlawfulness or crime, but stopping threats to the current post-war constitution of Germany, which, as some people on the chat room know, is not even a proper constitution, but a foreign imposed law. So look for foreign masters when you're talking about post-war German intelligence, and look for a steely determination not to allow people to wish for lawful change in Germany. And that's why the desperation has come in, I think.
Indeed. So, right, Alex, the next subject then is assisted suicide. And you wanted to highlight this BBC documentary and this article from the Christian Institute.
The Christian Institute is a remarkable collector of news on certain topics from around the world. And I'm starting to think that there is a coordinated decision, perhaps within the G7 or in some forum corresponding to the G7 member states, to promote euthanasia. And it seems to have happened in the last couple of months. At least we're seeing the fruits of it. Perhaps the decision was taken some time previously. So we've got a BBC documentary being criticised for promoting assisted suicide. Simon's Choice, I think, was the name of the documentary there. And the BBC's been accused of even perhaps breaching World Health Organization guidelines. So even the UN is shocked by how far this BBC promotion of euthanasia has gone. And then what happens in the very same week, I think you have the slide ready, we're talking about last week, so the middle week of February, we see, again, this is the Christian papers coverage, the RD, but others have covered it too, secular papers. We see a lady featured as one of the 3 case studies in a Dutch documentary on euthanasia. Now, what are the chances of that? Yes, so you have the quote there, which I've translated and picked out from the article. This is the Dutch Christian newspaper's editorial in response to this documentary, completely synchronized with the BBC documentary on the same theme. It says, anyone who watched the programme will have felt how Honey, the lady who we see die, was pressured to abide by the living will that she once signed. And I'll add in parentheses here, her own GP said, I'm not working on the basis that she wants to die. I'm not having anything to do with that because she's never told me she wants to die. But then when she gets into the hands of the euthanasia doctors, they know how to come up with the right answer. The quote continued, she was still driving around, going to watch skating contests and having drinks in the pub. And again, in parentheses here, we learned during the program that she has semantic dementia. In other words, she can't say much, but otherwise her brain is unimpaired. But, says the paper, her husband had made clear he was not planning to visit her if she ever ended up in a care home. And the euthanizing doctor found her one-word utterance away, that's huppakee in Dutch, somehow sufficient to constitute a clear and unmistakable wish to die. Now, the euthanasia legislation from over a decade ago in the Netherlands only allows for euthanasia in the case of unbearable suffering with no prospect of any recovery or deliverance from the situation. And this is the harrowing image, I have to say, of the lady being injected to death.
Well, actually, Alex, before the programme, I was saying to Brian, you know, in recent months, we've seen so much imagery coming from war zones and so on, which is some of it really harrowing. But I actually find this image possibly as disturbing, if not more disturbing, than some of those.
I'm going to say that I'm utterly disgusted with 2 of the people, actually 3 featured. One is the cameraman and anyone else from NPO who was in the room. 2 is the doctor for, well, you can gain something from his facial expression here, but certainly if you watch the documentary, you'll see that he says things after she dies like, oh, well, that one went pleasantly enough. She didn't rasp and snore like some of my patients when I inject them to death. And then thirdly, this husband here, who I'm going to say, I might be accused of insensitivity if I'm going to say it anyway, is masquerading as a concerned husband because he has, in his inimitable Dutch way, other nationalities maybe would be less blunt about this, said, oh, well, I'm not going to bother visiting you if you ever end up in a care home. And that's the result of really following people's own intentions of their hearts, is you end up with this. And you can read some of the, I would say, fear on that lady's face, yes, because only her speech has been impaired.
What do you think it's unfair to say that we're witnessing a murder there?
No, and Dutch politicians have said that she was murdered. This is from the land that invented euthanasia, legalized euthanasia. Even some non-Christian politicians in the Netherlands have said it was like watching livestock being slaughtered.
Alex, I know we're very tight for time, but I just want to add in there, if I may, that the UK column is being inundated at the moment with reports of suffering and death, predominantly elderly, but also vulnerable people within the so-called care home system. And what is coming to the surface is the denial of liquids, so ultimately dehydration and denial of foods, which is inducing a dementia-like state, and death is then following from it. Now, these are not just reports from ordinary members of the public. We're now getting reports from qualified medical people who are saying, in their opinion, what is now taking place is the widespread murder of people within the so-called care system. And of course, if you induce a dementia-like state by denying liquids, you can follow that up by drugs to supposedly counter it. You've then got an exceptionally vulnerable person who can then be euthanized, as we've seen in this picture. So I'd really like to say we are going to follow along this subject, but the number of reports that are coming in from all across the country, really quite extraordinary. One lady who's a lot of experience in the NHS said she now thinks that the NHS is working as a killing machine. Pretty horrific statement.
Yes, and one thing I just add in closing there is if you are shocked and disgusted that the Dutch could do such a thing, please bear in mind, and I'm close to Dutch healthcare, so I know what I'm talking about here. The reason that this is happening is because nurses in the Netherlands are completely unprepared to watch people go painfully and slowly. Bear in mind that if you're angry, as you jolly well should be, at seeing this lady being dispatched like that, then the Dutch have, yes, okay, it's still murder, but they've decided to do it this way because they cannot be as uncivilized as the British NHS and see people slowly starve and die of thirst.
And it's not just Holland. We've got you've two other articles from the Christian Institute here. French Senate approving sedated dying law, and that's from the 29th of January, and Canada as well from the 17th of this month. So this is reinforcing what you're suggesting, that this is something, there's clearly a global, or at least a Western policy decision being made here.
Yes. I wonder if it's Bilderberg. I wonder if it's G7. But even within G7, Catholic Italy would be a hard sell. Japan, which is an irreligious country, they still have respect for elders, but you might see that change. The US would have to be done, of course, either at state level or by nobbling the Supreme Court. It's possible, we discussed the questionable death of the Supreme Court Justice on the programme yesterday. It's possible that the Supreme Court is going to have one of these pre-cooked legal challenges for a right to die or assisted dying very soon, and that might be one of the reasons why they didn't want the old gentleman Scalia in the way.
Okay, change the subject then. So anti-drug vigilantes facing off against Burmese security. Now, of course, heroin is becoming an increasing problem in the world at the moment. And in the United States, many places have an absolute heroin epidemic. And for the first time, it's not restricted to the black communities. It's middle-class white communities as well in the United States. And the suicide rate going through the roof as a result. So tell us a bit about what's going on in Burma, in the poppy fields.
People might not be aware that Burma is ethnically diverse, and of the 14 provinces, only 7 are ethnic Burmese. In the east of the country, you've got the Karens and the Shan and other groups, and not only are they hill tribes, distinct from the Burmese, but they're also largely Protestant Christian because of former missionary activity. And a bunch of Baptists here have formed, well, they're described here as vigilantes. That's a very coloured term to use. I would call them a protest movement, but they also put their bodies in the way to block the security forces. And they have rather tellingly pointed out that Western NGOs have come to them and preached to these people who don't really need much preaching at. Here it is. So we have the Telegraph quoting here 2 rather admirable aid workers. One says, this group, Pat Jasan, has stepped into the anti-drugs battle out of frustration about the role of Burmese forces. Quote, they are a courageous group of people who have non-violently taken matters into their own hands after being fed up with the authorities' lack of fulfilling their responsibilities on drug issues and authorities allegedly collaborating with the drug producers and distributors, end of quote. And another person says, I think this is another aid worker, the poppy growers are not just poor helpless farmers, they are part of a larger dynamic of a drug lord warlord with close ties to the central government and the Myanmar army. Now, which side is the United States and the EU on? And then the second quote again, this is the new campaigner, Ngao Tong, says, the authorities said that destroying the poppy fields is the responsibility of poppy farmers and that we, that's the local protesters, just need to educate them without destroying their fields by force. Echoes of Afghanistan here, right? And end of quote by the campaigner Ngao Tong. We've educated the locals for about 2 years, but they are still planting poppies and still producing opium. Now, it's not the Burmese who are buying this stuff, is it? So who is telling them, please plant your fields and we can assure you your crop will be bought?
The same people that are killing us in our hospitals, perhaps?
Quite possibly, and perhaps killing us through an overdose of opium too, if they're humane, although I think they tend to use more horrible drugs than that. And I'll just add in closing on that one that the US Drug Enforcement Agency back in the 1970s set up a honey trap to lure the then Mr. Big of Burmese drug production out of the country and incarcerate him, fully knowing that that would cause a plethora of small players to arise in his place. And that was perhaps the deliberate loss of the opportunity that there was to close down the Burmese poppy trade.
Okay, Alex, it's book spot.
Thank you. Yes, here we have Networks of Empire. It's a bit of a policy wonk book, so I appreciate it's not everyone's taste, and it's not cheap either. But the full title is Networks of Empire, the US State Department's Foreign Leader Program in the Netherlands, France, and Britain, 1950 and 1970. Very revelatory. You can see that the post-war Social Democrats in all three countries were very skeptical about the US of the time, led as it was by the CIA, and were rather pointedly insisting on national determination of peoples in Europe. And they were nobbled, basically. The young rising stars, and in the case of Britain, it was notorious ones like Shirley Williams, were junketed and given State Department assistance, ultimately CIA funding, to sing the praises of the US. Again, the Dutch are the most honest of the bunch, and you can see in the Dutch chapters here lots of journalists saying, yes, I was paid lots of money to sell the United States, and more particularly the CIA and the State Department's way of doing diplomacy to our people. It worked. It was a very successful campaign. You can see here on one of the pages a politician from Mierlo, on this page here, who, beg your pardon, that page, who later pretended to be a great opponent of the United States. He actually founded a party. There he is waving out of a Cadillac on a crusade for Bobby Kennedy's election campaign in 1968. So, and he was honest enough to tell the journalist who wrote this book, Giles Scott Smith, yes, I used to do this when I was taken to America, and here you can use the photo. So he was almost unashamed of the fact that his anti-Americanism was a front.
Alex, just a quick comment there. I immediately picked up on the word leader in the introduction to that book, and somebody in the chat room at the moment is saying precursor to common purpose. It certainly smacks of it to me. This future leader program goes back to the same CIA type operations pre-war. Sorry, I think it does, is what I'm trying to say.
I think it does, Brian. And everything we've talked about today, don't get me in any sense wrong as an anti-American. I think I've made clear enough times that I'm very fond of the Americans. But the global headquarters of many conspiracies are in New York and Washington, because that's where the greatest power is. And we started with the EU, and we went through NATO and various other things, right through to assisted dying. A lot of these things are cooked up in think tanks or bodies which are on American soil, and then fed to the peoples of Europe, and not in the interests of any nation in Europe, or even in the interests of the EU as a body. And I think that's a case in point here. Common Purpose was started as a deliberate copy of the Phi Beta Kappa type fraternities in America. And I think I'm right in saying that Julian Middleton and others received a lot of training in the US. So certainly the model comes out of mid-20th century CIA.
Yeah, well, of course, Julia Middleton boasted in her book Beyond Authority that she got the idea from Common Purpose while she was in America, and then brought it over to UK, where she just happened to be given a mere £500,000 by banks. Okay, well, that's the end of today's news. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Excellent analysis as always. Hope the weather improves in Holland, or you remember to switch the pumps on. For everybody else, thank you very much for joining UK Column. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Theo. We've had some additional help in the studio today. So Theo has been buried behind the techno equipment. And thanks for that. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Good. I'll just say thanks to Merit here.